Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon, and I'm going to be the host today. Before we begin, we would like to take a few minutes to remember our comrade Gary Hicks, who passed away just the other day. And I'll just say a little bit about Gary, and then other people can chime in briefly. Gary was a lifelong fighter for the working class, and he was also a poet and a very learned person. So he wasn't only an activist in the mass movement, he was also a great thinker about what we should be doing to bring socialism closer to reality in this country. And when he was young, he participated in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and he, along with many others, burned his draft card in defiance of the US government. But Gary, along with not a very many other people, actually went to federal penitentiary as punishment for that for several years. And I always admired him for being so whip smart and so constantly applying that smartness to the questions of the day on the left. So Gary Hicks presente. Anyone else can join in.
Okay. Norman, I just found out from your statement. I knew Gary over the last 5 or 6 years. I participated in conferences with him around the People's Republic of China, since Gary was very much involved in fighting against not only the new Cold War, the continuation of the Cold War against the People's Republic of China, which is the great power of socialism in the world today. However, some might challenge that, but also in trying to learn from the experiences of the People's Republic of China in the struggle not only for socialism, but against racism and imperialism. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he never put up with any attack and any abuse. He came right back. He always came right back.
Thank you, Norman. Eugene, and then Yusuf.
Yeah, no, I really miss Gary. He was just like such a solid person, and he was very involved with the library, with ICSS, and so really good. And I just want to share one thing he told me about, because he remembers the day that Stalin died, and he remembers that
Okay.
he came home from school and he was like 10 or something, 8 or 10.
Yeah.
He said, oh, so this guy named Stalin died, and they say he was a very bad man. And his dad just got very angry and upset also. And he spent the day in his room. And when he came out, Gary could tell that he'd been mourning basically the death of Stalin.
Yeah.
And he said to Gary, basically, don't you ever let the white man talk shit about Stalin. And he was a real, I miss him already, and wish he could be with us. So
yeah.
Yusuf, and then Norm.
Yeah, thank you. I got to know Gary in the last couple of years, both in this forum and in the Peace and Solidarity Commission, and he also contributed to the Center for Marxist Education. And I really miss his brief but insightful remarks and his calm demeanor. It was a pleasure working for him. It's a great loss for all of us.
Thank you, Norma. You're next.
Okay.
Norma needs to be unmuted.
I got it.
Okay.
Just Gary was black.
Okay.
For anyone who has not met him or seen his picture. Okay. Rich, followed by Raj.
I'd like to say about Gary, I've known him since early 80s, but I really got to know him well in the last 5 or 10 years. I think it's been getting close to 10 years now, but it's when I got engaged with ICSS, when I first learned about it and started showing up and couldn't miss a Sunday morning. And that's when I got to know Gary even better. And in the last couple of years, I spent a lot of time with him. We for one, he did. I've heard this recently, but many times in his life, he would be in maybe called study groups or book clubs or whatever, reading a particular book with a group of people, like a few people or large, whatever. So with me, we were. I forget exactly where we started, at a coffee shop, and we decided, along with 3 or 4 or 5 people, that would meet Gary one day every week, just to talk and stuff. And we decided to read 3 books together, one of which was Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. Gary chose these 3 books. The other ones, I don't remember the names right now. I do know them, but this is the one we actually read. Gary and myself and one other comrade, Jamil, a friend of ours, a friend of Gary's, became a friend of mine. We took 1 year to read that book, about 10 or 20 pages a week at a time, every Wednesday night. And so in that time, I got to know him very well. On the side, heard a lot of stories like the one Eugene just told about his father. He told me that one in that one of those Wednesday night sessions. And I just wanted to say that there's a few people in my life over the last 50 years since I came home from Germany from the service and joined the anti-war movement and everything that was going on then. And Gary was one of the people that I would call, and proudly and honestly and deeply, one of my mentors. I don't call very many people that. About a handful, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen if I thought hard about it. People that I really worked directly with, they paid attention to me, and more than I would expect, almost like they would listen and talk to me. And I have to say one thing, Gary taught me this one thing. I still fight with it. I still struggle to manage it. And I would be talking on and saying something, taking 2 or 3 paragraphs to say something that he could say in a short paragraph, maybe 2 sentences. And he would say, Rich, TMI, TMI. And I'd say, what? He'd say, what's that mean? He'd say, too much information. So I'd say, he was trying to teach me, what do you call that? White-splaining or white mansplaining is the new way they say it, talking to a woman when you're trying to explain to a woman something she already understands better than I do. So I'm just saying that's one thing I learned from him specifically. I still work on it. I'm working on it right this minute, trying to shut up. So anyway, I want to say thank you very much, Gary. Carry on. Yeah.
Alan, thank you so much for finding that picture. I'm going to call on Raj, then Kit, and then Kathleen Densmore.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I met Gary in 2005 in the library. I didn't know him before then, but then saw him frequently at the library, and later he joined several study groups in which I was there, and also that very young people.
Okay, we have some feedback. Can we tell where it's coming from?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Raj.
So I traveled with him. I mean, he came to New York in one of the left forums, and he and I stayed in the same place spent 4 days, got to know him better. But he was most important thing most impressive thing about Gary was he was not only a poet, but he was also he would hold no negative thoughts about anybody. He would not say anything to injure somebody's feelings. He was extremely sensitive, no matter how much people disagreed with him or he disagreed with others. So he had a deep sense of humanity. That I was most impressed, and that I think that's the quality of a genuine communist. Gary was a genuine communist, in my opinion.
Thank you. Kit, and then Kathleen.
Yes, I met Gary in 1984 when I was only 25 years old, and he was one of the guys that hung out with me to help introduce me to Oakland. So I really appreciate that about him. And then I hadn't seen him. I worked on other things and had a job at, where I was just so busy, I didn't have time to socialize. And it wasn't till years later when I met him again at the Nebel Proctor, and we reconnected. But I still, because of my job, wasn't able to socialize much with him. But thanks to Rich, he stayed in touch through Rich, and we would try to get together when I had the time. But I will always remember Gary as, with great affection, fondness. He had an encyclopedic mind. He was extremely intelligent, witty, had a sense of humor. To me, he looked like Marx, but he was born on V.I. Lenin's birth date and on Paul Robeson's birthday, which is, something he must have gotten some of his talents from them. So anyway, I think other folks will have a lot more to say about his political history. I just knew him as a personal friend and just have a lot of great respect for him and what he's done. And he lived a long time, but he lived his life with purpose and dedication as a Marxist-Leninist. So thank you, Gary. Presente.
Okay. Kathleen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm still feeling sad. I'm so glad Raj said Gary had a deep sense of humanity. And I think that is so true. Gary, more than anyone I've ever known, when talking to him about a current issue, would say, but Kathleen, this really started in 1782. And then he'd explain what had happened in 1782 and how subsequent events laid the background for the current issue. I mean, he could bring, these are wonderful photos, he could bring the history that he'd been reading for decades to play at the drop of a dime and be so educative in that way. Also, I'm bringing forth to mind different special moments with Gary. I'll just share one. A long time ago, Gary and two other friends were over here for dinner, and one of my friends said something that I couldn't believe he said, and I was about to say something like, I can't believe you say that, kind of to lay into him. And Gary, I started, and Gary looked at me without saying a word and smiled and shook his head no, like basically, Kathleen, stop. And then Gary picked it up and talked to him in a very caring way to connect, connecting with my friend where he was and going from there. And anyway, I don't think I was ever with Gary when I didn't learn something valuable. And I'll just miss him forever, but he'll be right in our hearts, I know. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I don't see any other hands, so I think we're going to move on now to the program. and I have to bring up what I was going to say. Here it is. Welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Sharon, and I will be moderating today. In pre-pandemic times, we met only at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, and we've been doing that since, for about 15 years. And then the pandemic gave us the idea to be on Zoom. And when we're slowly going back, inching our way back to being at the library, but we will from now on have Zoom meetings or hybrid meetings so that we can include many people from around the United States and sometimes around the world. So good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm a member of the planning committee that organizes these sessions and maintains the website, which is ICSSmarx.org. And we also post on a YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist. And we also keep financial records because we do need some funds to continue our work. We are a platform for diverse presentations and discussion on political economy, the fight against racism and imperialism, socialism, the environment, in short, much needed alternatives to the voices of the corporate capitalist media that surround us. And we always welcome your feedback and suggestions. Our motto,
we'll be starting in a minute. So
our motto is what Karl Marx said. The philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. As a group, ICSS does not represent the views of any one organization, although we as individuals may express agreement with any number of different groups. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Norman Markowitz. Norman was born in 1943 and grew up in the South Bronx in a poor, predominantly Jewish neighborhood that became a poorer, predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. He developed an interest in socialism as a teenager, given the conditions in which he and his friends and neighbors lived. He attended the then free tuition City College of New York and the University of Michigan on a National Defense Act fellowship and received his PhD in 1970. He taught history at Northern Illinois University and at Rutgers University until today. His doctoral dissertation, The Rise and Fall of the People's Century, Henry A. Wallace and the American Liberalism, 1941 to 1948, was published as a book in 1973. He has written numerous articles for various print and internet publications, scholarly journals, encyclopedia, and Marxist and communist publications and websites on topics which include the history of the communist movement in the United States and its activists, and the role of anti-communism in US history. He served on the editorial board of Political Affairs, the theoretical journal of the CPUSA, for many years, and is currently a member of the international department of the CPUSA. Norman's topic today is racism, anti-communism, and the CPUSA's struggle against both in US history. He will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have a short break for announcements, and then another hour devoted to questions and discussion. So please, everyone, welcome Dr. Markowitz.
thank you. I hope I can follow Gary's advice and not bombard you, because that's one of my problems, with more and more information and more detail. But let me begin by saying that anti-communism and anti-radicalism generally in the United States has always followed the patterns associated with racism, with color racism. Similar to portrayals of people of color, anti-communist and anti-radical ideology portrays communists especially as invisible within the, quote, national community and demonized outside of it. Communists are simultaneously portrayed as enemies within and enemies without, as people of color were. Of course, in a nation which proclaims itself as the bastion of freedom and democracy, what does freedom and democracy mean? The right to be a nonconformist, yet this right is denied to communists, to radicals, and historically to people of color, because they are portrayed as not part of a national community. What is a national community? Here, it is capitalism itself, not an ethnocultural identity for those who carry forward this ideology. Now, people of color in general were quite visible, but those who weren't, who sought to pass, were in the US subject to the so-called one drop of blood standard. Any family background going back many, many generations would make one black and thus denied basic civil rights and civil liberties, invisible and demonized simultaneously. But with people's political beliefs, it's not a question of color or accent. So for conservatives and reactionaries, but later in the post-World War II era, for all power structure, all centers of political power, this became a constant search for statements, for expressions that would indicate, quote, communist leanings. People's organizational affiliations could then be connected to these statements, making guilt by association into a national policy. Lists of individuals and organizations could be created and expanded, both by private and governmental agencies, state and local Red Squads, the House Un-American Activities Committee, on and on. Most of this, though, was standard police state practice, the forms of repression that the struggle for civil rights and civil liberties, for liberty and democracy, have all fought to overcome through the world. Here, though, such repression was defined as necessary to defend freedom and democracy. In the South, under segregation, in the aftermath of the Civil War, which functioned as an informal and brutal racist dictatorship, white people who spoke out against institutional racism and racist terror were often routinely condemned or reviled in obscene terms and faced reprisals if they didn't remain silent. And that's important too, because if Mississippi in 1890, with segregation supported by the Supreme Court of the United States, if Mississippi was an example of liberty and democracy, then what wasn't an example of liberty and democracy? Anything you would proclaim anywhere in the world. Compelling trade unions, mass organizations to engage in their own anti-communist and anti-radical censorship was a central part of what this policy sought to achieve. In that sense, it copied color racism, whose purposes were first to prevent the unity of slaves and impoverished non-slaveholding whites from uniting, and then Black and white labor. Okay, So let's go back and begin to look at history. The American Revolution and American colonial and the American colonies. The British colonies in the 17th century were part of the first major bourgeois revolution for capitalism. In history, the British bourgeois revolution, called the Puritan Revolution, influenced directly the colonies that were created in North America, which in many ways advanced important parts of that revolution. However, that revolution brought with it not only people fleeing political and other forms of repression, but large numbers of, quote, indentured servants who came here faced with the economic dislocations created by the rise of capitalism, working in virtual slave conditions for 5 years, then were promised land that they would receive. When they were cheated out of that land, when they were cheated out of those material benefits in the 1670s in Virginia, which was a colony created by investors with the support of the British Crown, an uprising of indentured servants, as they were called. Bacon's Rebellion took place. That uprising was suppressed. There were reforms, but in the aftermath of that uprising, slavery, which had begun in North America in 1619 and would last until 1865, expanded. The British bourgeois revolution, by the end of the 17th century, while it was partial, the monarchy and the aristocracy was reestablished, had centered power in a class of merchants, landowners allied to the aristocracy. And political power over the colonies was centered in the Board of Trade. This was commercial or merchant capitalism. And this stage of capitalism also brought with it imperial rivalries, in which colonies were used as pawns of the major imperial powers. In the 18th century, as American colonials, merchants being the most dynamic group, but also landowners and slaveholders, because slavery was becoming more important, began to intermarry more, became a class in themselves. The colonies were used as pawns in wars between the two great empires of commercial capitalism, the British and French empires. A series of wars centered in Europe, in North America, also wars to control India, which many of us are not so aware of. The Great War, sort of a world war of commercial capitalism, of merchant capitalism, called the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in North America, resulted in a sweeping English victory. And with a much greater empire, with their position in India consolidated, with their control of North America consolidated, the British Empire now turned its attention on preventing an emerging national bourgeoisie in the American colonies from taking shape. And out of that conflict, out of that struggle, in the 1760s and 1770s, there came the representatives of these colonies resisting the policies of the British Empire, eventually launching a war against the British Empire, proclaiming a Declaration of Independence, a revolutionary document influenced by the English immigrant, radical, opponent of slavery, Tom Paine, reflecting the ideals of the 18th century Enlightenment, and a revolutionary war that resulted in a victory over the British colonial empire and the establishment or the foundation for a new republic in the 1780s. Forward. While this political revolution was taking place in North America, and it would influence directly what was the most important bourgeois political revolution in history, the French Revolution, which would follow. While this was taking shape, developing, a new stage of capitalism, a revolutionary stage, the Industrial Revolution, centered in Britain, was also in the process of development. The British Empire then sought to destroy, while it had withdrawn, and regain control of its American colonies. Out of that struggle, the leaders of the American Revolution who had come forward with radical statements, views, had advocated radical ideas, began to move in a much more conservative direction. A second rebellion by poor farmers, debtors, who had been ruined by British policy, Shays' Rebellion, which was suppressed, nevertheless became a background to the establishment of a constitutional republic, an American Constitution, to create a government that would be strong enough on questions of trade, on questions of defense, to defend itself against the restoration of the British Empire. That government, though, in practice, brought, because the slaveholders as a class, and this is chattel slavery. It is a slavery connected to capitalism. It is not the slavery that Marx and Engels wrote about in the ancient world. It is a slavery that is directly related to the development of capitalism from the 16th century on. The slaveholders are producing commodities to be sold on capitalist marketplaces. They have their own slave market where human beings are bought and sold, and it functions as a kind of stock market. I could give you examples of this. I do this in my class, of how the quotations on the slave market became important later in the decisions on the part of the political leaders of the slave states to launch their confederacy, fearing that Lincoln's victory would lead to the collapse of the slave market. In any case, to move forward, slavery and the slaveholder class were then written into the Constitution directly. And if we look at what follows, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who in the 1780s, a major drafter of the Declaration of Independence, had also drafted the Northwest Ordinance to bring territories into the new republic, and who had specifically barred slavery in the new territories. But that was then, and by the early 19th century, that was no longer Jefferson. Jefferson, slaveholder, champion of what he called a continental empire, an empire for liberty. Madison, Monroe, and of course, Andrew Jackson, who popularizes the term democracy. And what does he mean by democracy? Well, he says it very specifically. We are the party of democracy, the party of the common man, and we are the party of the white man's country, the white man's country. For Jackson, democracy meant territorial expansion, the conquest of the lands of the native peoples, and also the conquest of what were the northwestern provinces of the Republic of Mexico. This is what his proteges, particularly James K. Polk, then carry forward. And of course, earlier in the uprising led by slaveholders in Texas, I know there are people from Texas here, nothing personal, the establishment of the Republic of Texas. This policy defined democracy as a democracy that would maintain slavery and maintain the power of slaveholders and their merchant allies by gaining control of the West, gaining control of California. So what happened? While this definition of democracy was being advanced, socialism, the term, was now being used in Europe, in France, in England, but particularly in France. And in 1848, the year that the Mexican War resulted in great triumph, the Communist Manifesto was published, and a wave of revolutions swept Europe. Marx and Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, at the end, called upon communists to make the struggle for democracy an essential part of their struggle. The struggle for democracy meant to focus on the economic and social conditions that the working classes faced and suffered under. The struggle for democracy meant the struggle for political democracy and economic and social democracy. That's what it meant for Marx and Engels. It did not mean what the late historian George Frederickson called, when he wrote critically of Jackson and Jackson's ideas, Herrenfolk or master race democracy, not the democracy of manifest destiny, the democracy of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants bringing freedom and democracy by force through the Western Hemisphere. The first attacks on socialism were made in the US Congress by slaveholders, representatives of the slave states in the 1850s. But they connected socialism with abolitionism, interestingly enough, and the movements for land reform. In the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, though, a movement to challenge and to abolish slavery came into existence. The radical wing of that movement, the abolitionist movement, as it was called, as it came to be called, would be 100 years later, by historians influenced by Marxism and the writing about the Soviet Revolution, referred to as a revolutionary vanguard. A vanguard that would face persecution, terror, and murder, but in the 1850s, faced with the increasing demands of the slaveholder class, the more extreme policies of the slaveholder class, and the increase in their influence over the federal government, the national government, would create a broad center-left coalition, an anti-slavery coalition that would see the creation of a new national party. The Democratic Party, by the way, is the oldest ongoing political party in the world, using that name. It had its first convention in 1836. The new party, the Republican Party, united a wide variety of reformers, abolitionists, most of all, but also land reformers, champions of free public schools, champions of policies in the interests of the working class, with industrial capitalists and their finance and their bank allies, for whom slavery and the power of the slaveholder class had become a fetter on their own development. They were not necessarily at all supportive of these larger social revolutionary enterprises, but they wished to end slavery and create a new republic that would advance the interests of industrial capitalism. And for that reason, they supported the Republican Party. Ultimately, the Civil War as a revolutionary war led to what the economic determinist historian, not a Marxist, but in many ways a very positive historian, called Charles Beard, called a Second American Revolution, a revolution creating a new government, a government that would advance the interests of industrial capitalism. And in the post-Civil War era, a battle to democratize the former slave states, W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction would see the attempt to carry forward that democratization as essentially a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, a revolutionary state seeking to unite poor whites and former slaves. Karl Marx, by the way, who had seen the Civil War as a war not between people of the same country, not a brothers' war, as it would be called, but a war between two different social systems, one committed to the expansion of slavery, the other committed to its containment and its eventual abolition, a struggle for control of the Western territories. Karl Marx was initially hopeful that with the defeat of the slaveholders as a class, with their destruction as a class, the United States, which was, compared to the nations of the rest of the world, a political democracy, and a relatively advanced political democracy, would move in the direction of socialism more quickly than other nations. In fact, even as the industrialists, the financiers, and their allies, through the Republican Party, turned against labor, abandoned and betrayed the more than 4 million former slaves, in effect, abandoned the poor farmers who had looked to the Homestead Act. Marx still thought that these betrayals, which he understood, would lead these groups to come together to form a movement that would become a party, that would become a force for socialism. One could say that he underestimated greatly the power of color racism. And it was color racism which became more central as the Civil Rights Acts passed in the 1860s and 1870s, were largely repealed by the Supreme Court in the 1880s, as the governments established with Black suffrage and the support of many poor whites were in effect ousted through terror and murder, as the capitalist class, the triumphant industrial capitalist class of the North, in effect, accepted home rule on the part of the former slaveholders, plantation owners, and their allies, in exchange for their subordination. And the South itself became a kind of internal colony of Northern capital. a center for cheap labor, for the production of raw materials. Cheap labor, initially cheap white labor, later black and white labor to be exported to the North. In this context also, the socialist parties began to come into existence. Out of the suppression of the Great Strike, the Great National Railway Strike of 1877, which the troops that had been used to maintain the last remaining Reconstruction governments in the South had been taken out of those states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and brought north to suppress the National Railway Strike. And in the 1880s, the rising tide of racist terror, of lynch law, combined with the intensification of attacks on workers, attacks on attempts on the part of workers to form unions. In the United States, there were no laws as they were in European countries banning trade unions. Workers had the right to form unions, but employers had the right to use detective agencies, private police, state militia, and ultimately the federal government to suppress the army to suppress strikes. And this was the pattern that grew and grew. Let me quickly try to make sense of this point. It's something that I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. Usually, anarchist-based labor movements became influential in relatively backward countries: Spain, Southern Italy, Tsarist Russia. The United States was not backward in that sense, in terms of political democracy. But while the United States had, relatively speaking, an advanced political democracy, it had a brutal and repressive economic dictatorship. Company towns, similar to what existed in Tsarist Russia. The use of terroristic violence to suppress strikes and blacklist union organizers or anyone connected with the labor movement. A much higher level of violence, of terror and abuse, and a much lower level of protection than other industrialized countries from the 1870s really to the 1930s. Okay. Let me continue. I'm getting a little tired myself, but let me continue by looking, and we are going to get to the Communist Party soon. We still have plenty of time. The socialist parties that came into existence in the United States because of the political system, the two-party political system, and the level of repression that existed, but particularly the two-party political system, and the existence of diverse limitations on political parties at the state level, were unable to develop the kind of mass support that socialist parties developed in Europe during the period of the Second International. Eventually, and I'm skipping over important events like the Haymarket riot, which then led to a major, quote, Red Scare in the late 1880s, and the suppression of trade unions, along with a rising tide of racist violence, the trial of the individuals who were accused of being behind the Haymarket bombing, the execution of Albert Parsons, a socialist who became a labor anarchist, the frame-up against Albert Parsons. By the way, the first time the word communist was used widely in the United States was in response to the National Railway strike of 1877. And the man whose account of the suppression of that strike brought the word communist into general usage was Alan Pinkerton, the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Himself, by the way, before the Civil War, a Scottish radical, a Scottish Chartist, a supporter of the Union, who had formed his own detective agency and found that in providing spies, strikebreakers, provocateurs to corporations and companies, that was his biggest business, And Pinkerton detective agents Pinkerton agents had been involved in the provocations that led to the Haymarket trials and executions. Although he would be hanged in the late 1880s. Albert Parsons' wife, herself a labor anarchist and labor radical, Lucy Parsons, of African-American, Native American, and Mexican-American background, would continue his struggle for the rest of her life, writing articles and campaigning against racist terror and lynch law in the 1890s, becoming a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, the major sort of labor anarchist national organization created. And in her later years, with the formation of the Communist Party, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and other IWW activists coming out of the labor anarchist, or what Lenin would call a narco-syndicalist wing of the American left, would join the Communist Party and become an active communist in the struggles of the Communist Party, the successful struggles of the Communist Party against racism in the 1930s and for workers' rights, as would Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, as would others, as would left-wing socialists coming out of the Socialist Party at the same time. Okay. So let's now move forward. The Great War, the First World War of industrial capitalism, which produced the Great Revolution, the Soviet Socialist Revolution, which then became the basis for the organization of communist parties throughout the world. Vladimir Lenin, theorist and activist of that revolution. And I'm going to oversimplify, very much so, because of time and because I have to, the three great theoretical principles on which the communist movement would take shape. The first, the creation of a revolutionary vanguard party, which Lenin had put forward at the beginning of the 20th century in his classic work, What is to be Done? A revolutionary vanguard party that would prevent the factionalism that was undermining socialist parties throughout Europe, the factionalism, the divisions that would enable the capitalist class to play one group within the party against another, and a structure or a system called a democratic centralism, whereby the leader, the rank and file of the party at the various levels would choose the leadership of the party. Decisions would come from below, but once those decisions were taken, they would be followed in a unified way, in a united way. A policy that was later defined as struggling over the development of policy, and then when policy was developed, establishing unity around the policy, and then carrying forward that struggle. In the Chinese Revolution, it would be seen as struggle, unity, struggle, creating higher levels of struggle that would lead to higher levels of unity. The second principle, which Lenin put forward early in the First World War, state and revolution, was the establishment of a revolutionary worker state. Now here, the right-wing socialists, the social democrats as they came to be called, supported or believed that winning elections, gaining control of the existing state, the existing capitalist state, and then turning it into a socialist state through reforms would bring about socialism. Now, it wasn't happening. In fact, major socialist parties, majority socialist parties, had found themselves tied into existing capitalist states and existing capitalist power structures, which is why they had supported their governments, their countries, in the First World War. A worker state, not simply smashing the state, through eliminating the state through a great general strike, and then establishing collectives through the society, which was what the labor anarchists, the anarcho-syndicalists advocated. Both of those policies would not lead to socialism. In fact, they were already leading to disaster. That was the second great principle. And the third principle, and for the Communist Party of the United States, perhaps the most important, was the struggle against imperialism. In imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Communist parties and Marxist parties who had seen socialism as a system and a movement that could only take shape in the advanced countries, in the industrialized countries, in the developed countries, who had ignored largely, while they were anti-war, who had ignored what the imperialist powers were doing in Asia, in Africa, and for that matter, in what the US was doing in Latin America, because these nations were too backward to establish socialism. Some of them, some socialists had even supported, in the tradition of the Fabian socialists in England, in Britain, the expansion of imperialism is a good thing because it would uplift the people of the colonies. Lenin contended that it was the responsibility of the working class and the communists of the world to fight not only against imperialism, but to struggle in solidarity with anti-imperialist movements in the colonial regions of the world, and to build revolutionary socialist parties, Marxist parties, communist parties in countries like China, like India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was a qualitative breakthrough that without such a struggle, the working class could not liberate itself in the advanced countries, and of even greater importance, what imperialism, the imperialism of monopoly capitalism, what Lenin called finance capital, was doing, was to destroy the achievements of capitalist, quote, democracy, bourgeois democracy, creating militarized states, creating wars of the kind that the First World War had represented, wars to redivide the world, wars without limitation, wars that would produce brutal dictatorships. To paraphrase Rosa Luxemburg, this is not Lenin, creating a world where the choice would be socialism or barbarism. Socialism or barbarism. Okay. Now, this was the context in which the Communist Party of the United States came into existence. And now let me begin to look at the history of the Communist Party of the United States. Who were the communists? Left socialists, on the one hand, those who had left the IWW and similar groups on the other. What did they do? They brought with them these principles. And they began to create mass organizations to advance these principles in a way that the Socialist Party and the IWW and other similar groups in the United States haven't. They created, for example, the Trade Union Educational League, listening to Lenin's warnings to avoid left-wing communism, which he called an infantile disorder, working within the existing trade unions to advance labor solidarity. This was of limited importance, but it was of importance. Later, in response to the growing economic crisis, the crisis that would lead to the Depression, they created the Trade Union Unity League, which would come forward and struggle to achieve the industrial unions that the Socialist Party had advocated, but had not really advanced. They would organize strikes in the 1920s that were not successful, but strikes through their militancy that would win over workers. What is most important is that they keep on coming. They would keep on coming. They would not let defeats be transformed into defeatism. They would, on the crucial question, called the Negro question at the time, break with the existing socialist parties, and for that matter, the IWW. The IWW had organized Black workers, but it had not come forward with a policy. The Communist Party came forward with a policy making the struggle against color racism in the United States central to the party's activities. It contended that it was the mission of party activists to fight racism in the working class wherever it expressed itself, and to fight racism in their own ranks, something that the Socialist Party, for example, had never done. And that was one of the reasons why W.E.B. Du Bois, who had belonged to the Socialist Party before World War I, left the Socialist Party. The Communist Party also created mass organizations, the International Labor Defense, which played a central role, first in the unsuccessful defense of the two Italian immigrant anarchists, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, and then later in the 1930s, in the defense of the Scottsboro Nine, teenagers accused of having raped two white women, which they did not do, on a train in Alabama. They were riding the rails, illiterate, impoverished youth. It's a long, long story, and I could give you good work on it. But what the International Labor Defense did was to make the Scottsboro case a global case, because now the communist movement was a global movement holding demonstrations through the world, in Shanghai, in Berlin, where Nazis attacked in the early 30s, these demonstrations, mobilizing a campaign and fighting in the courts. It's a long story, but the Scottsboro Nine were not lynched, they were not executed, though they were sentenced to death in two trials, and more importantly, out of this struggle, a young African-American lawyer, William Patterson, who had participated in the defense of the Scottsboro, of the Sacco Vanzetti, in the Sacco Vanzetti case, emerged as a major leader of the international labor defense, and he would continue in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, facing imprisonment, to continue these struggles. And the struggles would produce, first of all, in the mid-1930s, the establishment of a National Negro Congress, in which a much more radical civil rights organization connecting the struggle for civil rights with the rights and struggle of the working class, in which the anti-communist socialist, A. Philip Randall, an important figure in the American labor movement, would join with mostly communist activists to create the National Negro Congress, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Out of these struggles, a generation of activists would come, fighting for a national anti-lynching law, fighting to integrate the unions, and out of these struggles also, and let me quickly jump back, because the Communist Party, faced with the Depression, the Great Depression, used its organizational skills to lead beginning in 1930. And this was global. The communist movement through the world had called for national demonstrations against unemployment as the international depression was taking shape. These demonstrations surprised the Communist Party leadership. They surprised the police because of their numbers. In the aftermath of these demonstrations, the Communist Party founded a national organization of unemployed councils. This national organization would organize campaigns through the country against evictions of people for non-payment of rent. It would organize campaigns calling for work relief, jobs for the unemployed. Most importantly, it would do something that no other left organization had done before. It would call for unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance, a term created by the unemployed councils. So much so that when the conservative AFL unions voted down unemployment insurance at their 1932 convention, they denounced it as a communist program. Communists continued to struggle through the Trade Union Unity League to form industrial unions. Communists and communist allies in 1934, as the New Deal government of Franklin Roosevelt provided the beginnings of what was a new center-left coalition. And I know, moving ahead, I think I have about 20 minutes more or so, or 15. How much time do I have more?
You can take until, yes, about 15 minutes would be good.
Okay. Let me then move ahead, beginning with the 1934 successful Bay Area general strike, the first and the last successful general strike in American history, in which a close ally of the Communist Party, the Australian-born Harry Bridges, played a central role. Communist activists struggling for industrial unions, and through other mass organizations were able to play a significant role in the Roosevelt administration's throwing its support to what historians call a second New Deal, a left New Deal, which saw Social Security, unemployment insurance, the WPA, etc. This legislation did not mean legislation itself does not mean that it will be implemented. Roosevelt won a great political victory in 1936, but with a political party, the Democratic Party, that still had its racist Southern Democrats, its corrupt political machines. In the aftermath of Roosevelt's victory, communist activists who had already played a central role in creating a new militant trade union federation, the Congress of Industrial Unions, the CIO, launched a series of strikes, the most important being the Flint, Michigan General Motors strike, in which communists played the central role, the leadership role. Roger Kieran has written about that. There's a good deal of very solid history about that, leading to the most important victory, strike victory in the history of the American labor movement. In the aftermath of that victory, large industrial unions were created. In the 1930s and 1940s, the communist movement played the central role in creating a broad center-left coalition around the New Deal, a center-left coalition that saw the most important social welfare legislation and trade union rights legislation established in American history. The Communist Party made many errors. If I had more time, we could go into them in greater detail. But so did everybody else. And what is important was that the post-war repression directed against the Communist Party of the United States, in which the party was demonized and portrayed as invisible in the United States, was carried forward with such intensity because of the achievements of the Communist Party here and the achievements of the global communist movement. For good or for ill, communists were able to do more effectively than any left party in American history, working within the American political system, which is a system based on interest group or pressure group politics, to advance a pro-working class program, a militant program. Communists were not able to transform the New Deal government into a labor party, a workers' party. But they were able, when Franklin Roosevelt died, not only to advance the policies that I've already mentioned, but to see the number of workers and trade unions rise from 3 million, less than 3 million, to over 15 million. They were able to see in a society that was still segregated, drives to end segregation and unionize the southern states. And at the end of the Second World War, the New Deal government had committed itself, Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights program, his second Bill of Rights program, to legislation that would have established a national health system under Social Security, the Wagner-Murray-Dingle Bill, which was on the table. Comprehensive national full employment legislation, which was on the table. Major federal aid to education, which was on the table. A National Housing Act, which would greatly extend the better aspects of public housing represented by the U.S. Housing Authority, which was on the table. New public power programs on the model of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was, and there, those who called it socialism were right. It was essentially a socialist program for the Missouri River and the Columbia River. All of this would be buried in the post-World War II era. Why? At the end of the Second World War, while the Communist Party had made significant errors, the US ruling class was, and I use the term schizophrenia. If you looked at the world, what had the war represented? What had the war brought about? All of the major powers, enemy and ally, the major capitalist powers were devastated. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. American capitalism controlled 80% of the investment capital of the world. US capitalists had won the war in economic terms by creating the two most powerful global agencies of capitalism and imperialism, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank at the Bretton Woods Conference. They could have it all. But 1945 was also the year of the greatest world revolutionary situation in history. There were powerful communist parties in France and Italy, two major industrialized countries. The British had already intervened to put down the communist-led resistance to the Nazis in Greece. The largest country in the world in terms of population, China, had a communist party that was already the de facto government of about 150 million people in northern and western China. The Indian national independence movement had as its most important political leader Jawaharlal Nehru, who had identified himself with the socialist movement and had expressed sympathy for the Soviet Union with all of its devastation. With all of its devastation, the forces for socialism, advancing for socialism in a collapsed global capitalist and imperialist world system was stronger than at any point in all of history. And in that context, the US ruling class launched its Cold War, its two-front war in the name of anti-communism, focusing on the Communist Party because the Communist Party here was its major enemy, and focusing on the labor movement here. And what followed was the persecution, the repression, connected to what Dwight Eisenhower would later call a permanent war economy that ended the Great Depression. The unions were purged. The legislation that I mentioned was never enacted. Some of it would be enacted in the 1960s. The leaders of the Communist Party were imprisoned under the Smith Act. Subsequent legislation to segregate the party, the McCarran Internal Security Act, the so-called Communist Control Act was carried forward, but the party survived. No other group did. The party continued its struggles. No other group did. The Taft-Hartley law, which would be used over time to cripple the American trade union movement, and still exists through its, quote, state right-to-work laws. The Communist Party mobilized against. The Democrats called for its elimination, but never eliminated it. The Communist Party fought against the dangers of nuclear war. As this consensus, which was already well in established before the alcoholic and drug addicted sociopath Joseph McCarthy, and he was literally that, an alcoholic, drug addicted sociopath, began to make hysterical charges, wild charges, similar to the kinds of charges Donald Trump became famous for making, and helped to bring this consensus, this repression into a kind of national hysteria. The Communist Party continued the struggle, campaigning for the Stockholm Peace Petition, campaigning against racism and imperialism, bringing to the United Nations with Paul Robeson and William Patterson, bringing it to the United Nations, a document of great importance, the We Charge Genocide document. The Communist Party faced further crises in the 1950s with the Nikita Khrushchev's attacks on Joseph Stalin and divisions inside the Communist Party. Its leadership was largely in prison at the time. The FBI, which continued to engage in far-reaching criminal actions, an incredible continuation of criminal actions against the party, played this to the best of its ability, trying to accuse certain communists of being racists, others of being anti-Semites, trying to divide the party. The party, while it lost membership, as did other parties, not only survived, but continued its struggles. And its struggles made possible the eventual defeat in the courts of some of the worst aspects of the repression. Repression didn't go away. It continued and continued and continued. A second great upsurge took place in the 1960s and 70s, and as the party struggled to regain its influence, the party was involved, party members were involved in that upsurge also, in the organization of groups like the Women's Strike for Peace, in the campaign against the Vietnam War. Celebrities like Jane Fonda became famous for their opposition to the war. But in the general media, Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party, who had spent years in prison, and Jarvis Tyner, who was still very much a leader of the Communist Party, they faced in Hanoi death and destruction with the massive bombing of Hanoi, and that wasn't emphasized at all. The resistance to the war, the Fort Hood Three, two of whose members were members of the Communist Party. Angela Davis. Communists continued through their the world organization that they represented, and earlier, communists played an important, communists and former communists, but ongoing communists played an important role in the development of the civil rights movement, in the campaigns against an FBI led by a monstrous man, who had held the position of head of the FBI for 48 years, J. Edgar Hoover, who combined perfectly extreme anti-communism and anti-radicalism with extreme racism, and whose personal corruption bounds. Okay, I can go forward with the end of the Soviet Union, with the battles that were then carried forward. Let me conclude, though, by saying that through its ups and downs, the Communist Party has remained the most important group, as I see it. And I'm not saying this as a loyal member, and I've been a member since 1978. The Communist Party has not only been the most successful and important group fighting for socialism in American history, it still is. And other groups that are coming into existence now, reviving, like the Democratic Socialists of America, they have the problems that they had in the past. And I don't see them, although I'm not here to speak against them, that would be that would not be so that useful, I think. I don't see them really confronting those issues, those problems. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I hope to do a lot more, but
thank you, Norman, so much. We're going to have to invite you back to talk about the history since that you referred to that you didn't have a chance to talk about.
Okay.
But we will take a short break for a couple of announcements, and then we're going to have discussion based on some questions and your answers. So let me call on Jean Rule to talk about future programs.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Norman. This was fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to have to have a lot of discussions on this continuing. But we also have some excellent programs coming up. Next week, December 11th, will be Iran's role in the anti-imperialist struggle. And Brahman Assad, an Indian-American peace activist and president of the U.S. Peace Council, will discuss that. Following that, on December 18th, it's not really clear. We have scheduled the elections in Brazil, but we may also talk a little bit more broadly about what's happening in Latin America. Then, thankfully, brings us into the seasonal holidays on December 25th and January 1st, in which we will take those days off. Coming back next year, we have a series of programs, Marxism and the Problems of Linguistics, Stalin's work, and China's dynamic COVID policy, facts from the East and fictions from the West, and more. So these will, I think they're all listed on our website. And we also have our weekly calendar. And if you would like to subscribe to the weekly calendar, go to our website, icssmarks.org, and you'll have a chance to fill out the form there. But again, back to you, Sharon. And again, looking forward to our discussion. And thank you, Norman.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to say a few words about our need for funds?
Well, we have a continuing need for funds to operate our programs. I put an entry in the chat to show you how to contribute if you are able, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to have a discussion now. Please raise your hand if you want me to call on you. The raise hand button is under reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And please limit your remarks to 2 minutes or less so that we can accommodate everyone, and we can probably have a second round. You might get called on again, depending on how many people want to speak. Before I call on the first person, I just want to add, thank you very much, Norman, for that tour de force from a communism historical materialist point of view of US and world history. And I want to add that I too am an alum of the, at that time, free City University of New York.
Yeah.
Hopefully we will return to the day when public higher education is free.
Yeah.
So I want to call on Alan and then Raj. Go ahead, Alan.
Excuse me, should I answer each question individually?
Oh, yes, you can.
Okay.
Yes, you
Okay.
have that opportunity. Or if you want to
Okay.
bundle a few questions, it's up to you.
Okay.
Alan.
Hi, Norman. You did a very good job presenting the picture of how the United States emerged in the post-war period at the pinnacle of its economic, military, and political power. My question is, and how, following on from that, they were able to launch this offensive to crush the communist movement in the United States. My question is, given today's conditions, what is the possibility and the possibility of liberal alliance to revive the kind of reform struggles that took place in the 1930s?
Okay. That's a really interesting and important question. First of all, we faced in recent years, and our party has played a major role in trying to analyze this, and I've written on it, the direct danger of neo-fascism, which had its most important center in the United States, in the Trump presidency. Neo-fascism, which has interacted with what the world calls neoliberalism, but which is the old right-wing Coolidge, Hoover, Mellon policies of eliminating regulation, repressing wages, deregulation, privatization, and wage repression. What we face today is a United States that in no way has the power globally. It has the military power, but nothing else. It has the military power that it had in the early Cold War era, but from controlling 80% of the investment capital of the world, it is now the leading debtor nation by far on earth. The military industrial complex, which was the engine for economic expansion from World War II to the 1970s, has undermined the economic development of the United States over the last 40 years. Military spending has taken away from overall economic development greatly and intensified, and even the export of capital. Also, the United States faces, in the People's Republic of China, a very different rival. China is developing a new model of socialism based on a mixed economy with a capitalist sector that, in principle, works to expand the public sector. And under these circumstances, the dangers of reaction and fascism are great in America, very great, and we've seen it in recent years. But there are large numbers of young people particularly, and people generally, who can be reached. And I think the possibilities of reaching out to masses of people who have been depoliticized in building a mass movement that will lead to the creation of a new mass politics is there. And that's the position of our party, to build the equivalent of a broad people's front that will be carried forward politically. How we do it specifically, we can discuss and debate how to do it, but it can be done. There are models that I would come forward with if we had more time, models that were used in other countries with one, and then I'll just shut up after this. If the anti-capitalist left would begin to run candidates in districts where the Republican right has absolutely no chance to win, so the lesser of two evils argument would not prevail. And this was done in the past. It was done in the formation of the British Labour Party over 100 years ago. It would be possible to begin to elect people who are not beholden to the Democratic Party machine, and begin to elect people who, one, would lead the democratic organizations to move sharply to the left, to co-opt them, but more importantly, open up a new politics. That's one possibility, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Raj,
Yes.
you're still muted, Raj.
Well,
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for pointing. Thank you, Norman, for a very informative presentation. I learned a lot from your presentation. It was a good class for me.
I'm glad.
I want to bring to your attention the one issue that I think is important historically and also presently. And I think that is the development of liberalism in the 1960s under a Great Society program. And that created in the Democratic Party, a group of Black leaders that have actually become very effective support for imperialism. Biden's, which I consider Biden to be more dangerous than even Trump, in my opinion, because he's a aggressive imperialist, and he came with the support of South Carolina prominent Democrat, and that's why the next primary, season will start with South Carolina. So the Black leadership that emerged got co-opted by the liberalism and the liberal Democrats. And I think what I wanted you to comment on is how the Communist Party, which basically champions the Black liberation, has become ineffective, in my opinion, by becoming too closely associated with liberalism. In fact, much of the left has become that way, not just the Communist Party. And what are your thoughts on that? How this can be decoupled so the Marxists could organize workers for a socialist revolution? That's a big question, but anyway, that's what I'd like you to comment on. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a good and a very difficult question. Let me say, as someone who has studied liberalism in its varying definitions in the United States for more than half a century, let me say that what liberalism is, the meaning of liberalism in America, shifts and changes in various periods of time. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s did bring about a generation of Black elected officials that simply did not exist before. It's not a question, I think, of them being co-opted. It's a question of what their choices were and where they were going in a post-segregation world. I'm not a fan of Biden. I don't see him as potentially worse than Trump, even as an imperialist. He may end up that way. But I think we should not simply underestimate what Trump represented in terms of what fascism is. The leader cult, the incitement to violence, the attack, the open racist attack on foreigners, on minorities, et cetera, the identification with what globally are the characteristics of fascism. So the Communist Party has played a central role and continues to fight for Black liberation and the liberation of the African-American people. But we, at the same time, struggle to find leaders who will best represent that struggle. And I'm not going to, if you say that there are blacks who have been co-opted, sure. If you say that there are trade unions, legions of trade unions who've been co-opted, sure. But to directly attack these people, to directly attack elected black congresspeople without an alternative is self-destructive. To use a term that a communist leader used in the 1930s, we would be isolating ourselves now for fear that we will be isolated in the future. We'd be isolating ourselves now. Okay, so I have this great quote from, which this great quote from a non-Marxist socialist, Nehru, which I had planned to read, but you might find it interesting, maybe if we have time at the end. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Janet, followed by Jean, followed by Richard F. Go ahead, Janet.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your presentation, Norman. I wanted to add that, yes, the U.S. has military might, but it also has a major propaganda and censorship machine.
Oh, yeah.
That will affect any kind of organizing or movement or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So I've not been as involved in the communist movement as many of the participants here. So please forgive me if my comments and questions are possibly naive. Anyway, so I just have a few questions. You said that Marx thought a socialist movement or party would form in the US, but didn't he read the US Constitution, which protects property? I mean, that underlies a lot of the, what stops socialist communism. That's one question.
Okay.
Another is, would you describe the origin of the relationship between the Communist Party in the United States and the government in the USSR? Like when did that, what's the connection there, and when, going back, the origin. And then finally, so related to, well, social democrats working within the system to reform it failed, you said early on in the early 20th century, right? But it appears that, to me, Bernie Sanders and the progressive Democrats, they're trying to do the same thing and failing. And where is their anti-imperialism? I don't see it, but anyway,
Okay.
I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, well, Janet, thank you. I think you could keep me going, really. I'm going to have my 79th birthday on December 10th, and you could definitely keep me going at least to my 80th birthday, answering those questions at the very least. One, the Constitution of the United States, it's changed throughout history. The Constitution of the United States did not have universal suffrage. The Constitution of the United States defended slavery. The Constitution of the United States has been amended and reinterpreted and amended and reinterpreted throughout history. One could do what progressive pro-New Deal judges did in the 1930s. I would say, it's just an idea, take the general welfare clause, of the Constitution, and use that to advance socialism. The general welfare clause was used by the pro-New Deal judges to declare the National Labor Relations Act constitutional. Previously, it would have been unconstitutional. Social Security constitutional. Unemployment insurance constitutional. the TVA constitutional. So that's one answer to your question. As for the relationship of the communist parties of the world to the Soviet Union, the Communist International, or Third International as it was called, Comintern, came into existence in 1919. The Soviet Union was the center of the world communist movement. It defined itself as developing because of its size and its enormous ethno-cultural diversity, a family of peoples with cultural rights, social rights, all united in constructing socialism. And the communist parties of the world proclaimed their solidarity with the Soviet Union and did not oppose the Soviet Union in its major policies. The history of the Comintern is a much more complicated thing. It really is. The argument that most Americans were taught in school was that orders came from Moscow on everything and simply they were followed. That is not true. There's a good deal of scholarship to show that the various commissions of the Comintern with the representatives of the various countries of the world then developed the policies that were put forward for those countries. There was a tendency to over-centralize, true, but the argument that the Communist Party of the United States was simply an extension of the Soviet Union, that argument was put into law, used to arrest the leaders of the Communist Party, to keep them in jail for years. And it's simply false. Your third point, yeah, what can you say? What I said in the about social democracy in the early 20th century, yeah, you could say that about Bernie Sanders and others. Bernie Sanders tried something that was initially, I thought, very, very interesting and remarkable. As someone who was not in the Democratic Party as such, as elected as an independent, proclaiming himself to be a socialist, he went into the Democratic Party, and had there been in 2016 a real national primary and other, he might have even won the nomination, but it's possible. But in any case, where that policy right now is definitely not working, and where it will go is unclear. As for imperialism, yeah, your point is well taken. Sanders and others are similar to the Social Democrats in that they are for peace, they say, and they are. But in terms of a serious critique of imperialism, I don't see it developing from them. And the question is to struggle to put forward that critique of imperialism so that it becomes essential, so that they have to deal with it. Anyway, thank you for the questions that I could spend to my 80th birthday at least answering.
We know that's true. It's so deep. These questions are very deep. The queue, I'm going to call on Jean, followed by Richard F., followed by Richard W., followed by Yusuf.
Okay.
Jean, go ahead.
Okay, well, let me state at the outset that I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Communist Party USA.
That's your problem.
Having said that, I will say that some of my best friends are communists, and they've had a tremendous impact on my own intellectual and political development. And one of these was Herbert Aptheker, who had a very interesting career. I heard him talk, met him, and really did have a big impact on that. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that. And also, so that communists, I think, really have had a disproportionate influence on people, even though that's from time not acknowledged. And I did want to say that. And also, I've been a supporter of Bernie Sanders from the beginning, and I've caught some flack from various people. I'm a member of DSA, and I think our comrade Gary Hicks was also a member of DSA and a number of other organizations, including the U.S.-China People's
Yeah,
Friendship
right.
Association.
Right.
He's very, very ecumenical person in that regard. So I just wanted to say that. But again, and Bernie is an interesting guy, and I do support him. And I have, the whole Bernie movement is very interesting.
Yeah.
But having said that, I know people won't be happy unless I hold up my Settle for Biden cup. And coming up, it's a really important election, and it could very well go the wrong way. And Trump belongs in the big house, not the White House. So
Yeah,
I'll
well.
just leave it at that. But again, thanks for this discussion, and any comments you have, I'd appreciate.
Yeah. Well, let me say that without going into specifics, putting Trump in the big house, prosecuting him, is something that we should be demanding, in large part because we don't want January 6th to end up in American history what Adolf's 1923 beer hall putsch was in German history, a precursor of much worse things to come. And your other points about Bernie, I understand. In fact, for what it's worth, I did vote for Bernie in primaries a couple of times.
Yeah. Let me just note, on next year, February 5th, Sunday, we do have a talk on Hitler's rise to power.
Okay.
So that should be a good thing, and I just want to give people a heads up.
Thank you. That's it. And I'll try to make that. Okay.
Okay, Richard F.
Thank you. One of our previous speakers, I think it was Greg Godel's, talking about the Communist Party. He referred to 3 periods of anti-communism within the Communist Party. The J. Lovestone period of leadership, the Earl Browder period of leadership, and the Sam Webb period of leadership. And nobody was able to pick that up, and we didn't. I wonder if you have any comments or thoughts on that, issue.
Yeah, I can, and I will.
Okay.
I've written on Lovestone, an incredible adventurer and character who ended up as working with the Central Intelligence Agency to create the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions after World War II, who earlier had formed his own group after he had been defeated in the leadership. It's an incredible story. And eventually moved further and further to the right, so much so that during World War II, he threatened to sue his own supporters for continuing to call themselves Lovestonites. I can deal with Lovestone in great detail, and certainly he became, as a defeated factionalist, one of the world's more important anti-communists. And there were others too, out of the Trotskyist movement, the followers of Max Shachtman in the United States, particularly Irving Kristol and his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, the parents of, what's his name, William Kristol, a leading neoconservative. These individuals have played their role in American history. As for Earl Browder, Browder abandoned Marxism-Leninism at the end of the Second World War. He sought to turn the Communist Party of the United States into the Communist Political Association, making it into something like the Fabian Society in Britain, that it would be an association, not a party. an association of trade union activists, intellectuals, et cetera, that would influence largely the Democratic Party as a pressure group, period. And that was not accepted by the party leadership. He resigned from the party. He wasn't really expelled. And eventually the party did reconstitute itself. And the party's reconstitution of itself was then used in the Smith Act trials for the imprisonment of its leaders. As for Sam Webb, his leadership, and this is my own view, and I speak as someone who was critical of that leadership. He resigned his leadership of the party. He did, not the membership so much, but the leadership moved the party in a much more conservative direction. He sought to change party official policies. He was not successful in that regard. I would say only that had the party had a stronger and a better leadership, had it had a more militant leadership, it might have accomplished more in the early 21st century. I'll say that without going into I wouldn't on any level compare him to Lupstone, to put it mildly, or even to, well, Earl Browder necessarily. Okay, so, and I could go into detail on that too, greater detail. But the present leadership of the party, Joe Sims and Rodana Cambron, represent the best of what the party has stood for and are moving forward to develop the party further. That I would say without any qualification.
Thank you. Richard W., you're next.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say I cannot make the same disclaimer as Gene.
Oh boy. Okay.
Whether for good or bad. I'm going to leave that one. I was noticing, or I've noticed, or whatever, that the term capitalism tends to be associated with the term industrial, much more so than agricultural.
Yeah.
And at the risk of inciting previous debates, it seems to me that the CPUSA, CPUSA has focused primarily on the industrial side of things, and has very much ignored the rural side. In contrast to China. And I was wondering if you could, and I think that leads to some other things. I think, for example, I think there's an association of racism here with the agricultural side of things. That's only been, well, it's part of the South. Of which the South is barely getting out of its agricultural agrarian stage and into the industrial.
Yeah.
Can you maybe comment on the organizing of the agricultural side of things?
Okay.
And getting out of the cities in particular.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Richard, you make some good points. The communists were involved, particularly in the South, and Robin Kelly's fine book with Hammer and Hoe is a wonderful expression of this, in the struggle to organize sharecroppers and also tenant farmers. The Communist Party has been involved and was involved in the struggles to organize farmers, farm workers. The Communist Party, communist activists were involved in the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. that played an important role initially in trying to develop cultural solidarity, then labor solidarity with rural whites, and then in support of civil rights. And there is this history. I'm not saying that it is less important because the United States has been an industrial nation, and it's been an urban industrial nation.
Well, I think that's really only since the turn of the century.
Yeah, since the turn of the 19th century.
Well, the 20th century, in fact.
Yeah, since the beginning of the 20th century.
Industrialization, you know.
Yeah. Well, the Communist Party came into existence in 1919.
The factory line was before it in the 20s.
Yeah. Well, and a little bit early. Yeah, you're right. I'm not being critical, but there is this history, and it's a history of seeking to bring farmers and workers together in organizations to advance the interests of both. The South is another story. The South was a brutal racist dictatorship until the 1960s. Blacks did not have the right to vote. Large numbers of poor whites did not have the right to vote thanks to the poll tax. Police repression was the norm. The Ku Klux Klan, as one major civil rights leader, the Reverend Shuttlesworth, a close ally of Martin Luther King, noted in the 1950s, often the police and the Klan were the same people. So under those circumstances, the Communist Party did play an important role in what was hoped to be the Southern organizing drive of the CIO at the end of World War II that might have radically changed things in the South generally, but that was abandoned. The question of the South is still there, and it's an enormous question. The old solid South of segregation and open racist dictatorship was the stronghold for the most reactionary centers of the capitalist class. The new South, the new reactionary Republican South, in terms of national politics, still plays that role. It's less brutal, but it's still there. And how you deal with it has to be confronted. How you deal with it in terms of universal suffrage, real universal suffrage, how you deal with it in terms of eliminating money in politics. This has been done in other advanced capitalist countries where you have sharp restrictions, if not elimination of the use of money in political campaigns, where you have universal suffrage for real, where you have independent electoral districts, no gerrymandering, independent electoral districts. Without these kinds of reforms, major reforms, which have been carried forward in a number of countries successfully, American politics will continue at best to be, to use a term from sports, a minor league democracy. Okay, I hope that answers the question.
Okay, let's see. The next person in the queue is Yusuf.
Thank you very much. I have a short question and a comment. The question is, maybe could you give us a small preview about the CPUSA and the crisis created by Gorbachev? My comment is directed to Isvara's comment about Marx. Yes, Marx supported the Union very strongly and prevented British and French intervention
Yeah.
in favor of the Confederacy, and also organized workers. And I think Abraham Lincoln said, thanks. The British workers in England, the Union, even though the blockade caused some jobs. But on contrast, this was non-trivial. Proudhon advocated neutrality, said, woe to both houses. In fact, he sort of liked the decentralized nature of the Confederacy without thinking of the reasons, the class reasons behind it.
Yeah.
But to his credit, Bakunin was in the US. He was supposed to ensure neutrality of American anarchists in the Civil War. But after consulting many figures and leaders, he decided against it and he supported the Union.
Yeah. Okay, well, those are interesting points. In fact, thank you, Yusuf, and it's great to see you as a friend and comrade. Okay, the International Working Men's Association, the First International, committed itself to the Union. I've written on this, Marxist statements against those bourgeois liberals, even bourgeois abolitionists, who would not support Lincoln because he'd not early come out as an abolitionist. As I tell my classes, by the way, with all the attacks, particularly today, on Democrats as communists, the only political party in which followers of Karl Marx and the First International, who call themselves communists, like Joseph Weydemeyer and others, who rose to positions in a political party, was the Republican Party during the Civil War. And brought information and material into from the First International into Republican. Not that they were ultimately successful; they weren't, of course. But the point is that the support that the First International and Marx particularly gave to the Union was important in mobilizing through the International Working Men's Association workers to oppose the policies of both the British and French governments, who, for their own purposes, would have liked to have seen a Confederate victory, to divide the Union, to divide North America as because it was their rivals. We got to remember that during the Civil War, Napoleon III, that wild adventurer, put an Austrian aristocrat on the, quote, throne of Mexico, and with French support, tried to create a puppet state in Mexico. So yeah, you are very, very right. The support for of Marx and the First International, which continued for the Union and what the Union represented.
Thank you. I'm going to call on myself, followed by Kit and Rich.
Okay.
In the queue. I just had a couple points I wanted to make. We should not forget the role of women in the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And I would particularly point to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who went to prison under the Smith Act. She was in prison in the Alderson Women's Penitentiary in West Virginia, and she wrote a book about that called The Alderson Story, My Life as a Political Prisoner. And I highly recommend that book.
Yeah.
Also, any book by Anna Louise Strong.
Right.
And then there is this recent book called, it was published, I think, earlier this year, Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me in my humble opinion, it was the women, especially the Black women, who maintained the party through the worst of the McCarthy attacks. Although they were very rarely known outside of the circles of the party. You mentioned, well, before I get to that, we should also not forget the non-aligned movement, which was to a large degree pro-Soviet, at least not anti-Soviet. And I think it played a major role in the Cold War and the struggle against the United States, US imperialism. And I am very close to the Communist Party, but I'm also a member of the Democratic Party because I believe that communists should be everywhere, including the Republican Party. And one thing that the thing I hold against Barack Obama the most, as someone who worked on both of his campaigns, is that he murdered Omar Gaddafi, who was a leader of the non-aligned movement and was about to launch. He was the newly elected president of, or head, I don't know the office, name of the office. He was the newly elected head of the African, what was it called? What is it called? The African Organization of African Unity. Yes, and he had major plans for that, which were essentially nipped in the bud by his demise. And finally, I wanted to say that you mentioned mistakes. You referred to mistakes that the Communist Party has made over the years. I think one of the mistakes, although I completely understand it, was ceasing to run candidates for president and vice president. So I believe that the last time the party did that was in 1980 when Gus Hall and Angela Davis ran. And I know it's much, much harder now than before to get on the ballots of every state. They've made it much more difficult. But still, I think it would have been good if that practice had been continued.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you. Those are really very good comments. Let me apologize for not emphasizing the role of women activists in the Communist Party. That's a huge omission on my part. And I agree with you. Women activists, both white and Black, played an essential role in keeping the party together, particularly during the high Cold War period, referred to in general as McCarthyism. And that's all true. And of course, remarkable women like Claudia Jones, who was deported and continued her work in Britain, where she played an important role in the ongoing struggles against imperialism. Your comments about the non-aligned movement, I agree with it. Of course, it comes into existence in the 1950s, and it is targeted massively by the CIA with all of their adventures, and I can go into that in great detail, including one of my favorite stories, comical stories. The CIA is looking for non-European, non-white people to come to denounce the Soviet Union and a non-aligned union. So who do they get? They get a small group from New Jersey, a small sort of Asian groups, the Kalmucks. The Kalmucks had been forced by the Stalin regime onto collective farms. They were backward people. They then some of them sided with the Nazis, and in terms of during the Second World War, then they were expelled, and it's a long tangled story. But I have the socialist leader, Norman Thomas, who is friendly with the head of the CIA at the time. This is from my own research, Alan Dulles, the brother of John Foster Dulles, and he's asking him, why are we going to sponsor the Kalmucks? Why? Because the Kalmucks are the only group of, quote, non-Europeans, non-whites that we can blame the Soviets and the communists for, quote, persecuting. And this is the kind of thing that was going on. And yeah, and there were all kinds of people, endlessly. The non-aligned movement was important, but it's important to understand that American imperialism plays these games, using individuals as puppets.
Women are being murdered in Iran in the tens
Yeah.
and hundreds.
Norma, you're out of order. Please do not interrupt.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those points are that you made, I think, were good points. And your last comment, Sharon. Yeah, I understand that as a criticism. In fact, one of my first actions in 1980 was to go to California and campaign to get Gus Hall on the ballot, and it was sort of wild stuff, and all of the limitations and the attempts. Essentially, I think the party leadership, because of Reagan and the Reagan policies, decided not to run presidential candidates, thanks to the Reagan policies and the Reagan reaction. Was that an error? Yeah, you can. That's you can say that's a reasonable point. And the subsequent conflicts inside the party, with in the aftermath of the downfall of the Soviet Union, that played a role too. But you know, I those are all good points. Those are all really good points. And thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next is Kit, followed by Rich. Go ahead, Kit.
Yes, thank you very much for coming to speak today, Norman. It's appropriate that your talk today is happening after Gary Hicks's passing, and he would be very happy to hear you talk today if he were with us. And I in my mind hope that he is with us. I think in our spirit, in his spirit, he is. But anyway, I didn't get the description of your background in the email, but I was wondering, how long have you been teaching your students? What university are you at? And post-COVID, corporations are recognizing that the so-called current Z generation is quite challenging and demanding of better working conditions and social and environmental issues in the US. Can you comment about the different generations of students that you've taught over the years, and how different are they now and why? And are they responsive to being open to communist views? Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I began to teach in 1969 at Northern Illinois University. I came to Rutgers in 1971. I taught at what was a college that was largely created by the student movement and the civil rights movement, Livingston College, which existed as one of the federated colleges in the Rutgers system at a time when there were virtually no Blacks, Latinos, and at Rutgers College and the other colleges, and a college with a lot of left and radical people of all kinds. That college was eliminated with the reorganization that took place in 1981, and I have continued to teach over the decades. It's difficult to really look at the generations of students. It's become harder to be a student because of the fact that students are much more in debt. To give you some idea, Rutgers had tuition, but when I first came there, the tuition was $350 a year. Now it costs many, many, many thousands, many thousands. Student debt has become an enormous, I could get the numbers offhand, but, and students, I found over the years, in terms of going out, they are, they're more open to ideas, much more so. They're much more open to ideas. And here, in given my experience, getting them to really go out in demonstrations and struggle on the streets, getting them to go out is, over time, it's become more difficult because of perhaps their debts, perhaps their fears of where this will lead them to. That's an honest answer. Now, hopefully that's changing. Hopefully that's changing. This Tuesday, we're going to have a major rally at Rutgers, trying to bring together faculty and students of our union, because we have been working without a contract for a very long time. We have been unionized for a very long time, and we face an administration that verbally is liberal and progressive for the first time, but is in reality turning over its labor relations to individuals who are actively engaging in classic union busting tactics, and also using contemporary technology to take away from faculty and departments all sorts of basic control over their work processes, et cetera, turning over the organization of courses to machines and algorithms. Unbelievable stuff, and forcing more and more evaluations that intimidate people. So, and we'll be holding that demonstration. I hope to be there if I'm well enough, and hopefully we'll get students to go along with the faculty. Hopefully we'll get faculty too.
Oh, that's good news. We have only 5 more minutes because we're going to close at 1 o'clock Pacific time. So I'm going to call on Rich and then Tajan, and those people are going to be the last 2 in the queue. I can't, but each of you has 2 minutes, not more. And then we're going to give Norman 1 minute to say final words. Go ahead, Rich. Are you
okay?
Still?
Hello.
Yes. Go ahead.
I heard you, Sharon. Okay, thank you, Norman. I can't say how much I appreciate your talk today. I'll just say thank you very much, and we'll follow up. So here's my question. I believe you were previously engaged with the Political Affairs, the theoretical journal of the Communist Party. And my question is, what do you see the prospects of that being brought back, however?
Okay, that's a good question. We have sort of fought to do that, and it's an ongoing struggle. I can't give you any positive or negatives, but it's something that a number of us have been trying to do for a while.
Thank you. Tejan.
I enjoyed this talk by Norman. I remember seeing articles from him in Political Affairs and always enjoyed those. And I also think that Norman should have more webinars, study events for other people that need to learn a lot of this history. That's my comment.
Okay, well,
thank you. Okay, well then, with those short comments, I guess I will call on Isvara. You'll be the last person, Isvara.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. The only reason why I insist in speaking today is because today is the 50th anniversary of Allende's speech at the United Nations.
Okay.
He's on December 4th, 1972, and all of us Chileans in Chile, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Sweden, are trying to listen to that speech once more. It sounds like if it was written today, it's extremely poetic, and I recommend it. And also because as soon as Allende was elected, there was serious demonstrations all over the country against him. Even before he took power as president, people in the military especially were murdered. Yeah. And I was watching at the demonstrations in China these days, and they seem to me like carbon copy of those demonstrations that were all completed, financed by the CIA. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Isvara. We're going to give Norman the last word.
Okay, quickly, just to respond to Isvara, I don't think that the demonstrations going on right now in China will lead to the overthrow of the People's Republic of China. The murderous crimes of US imperialism against the people of Chile are among the most sordid and grotesque of in this history. Monstrous crimes for which the Nixon administration and particularly Henry Kissinger deserve to be held accountable. Henry Kissinger is still alive. Henry Kissinger is a war criminal, a monster, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Let me end quickly with, as I had mentioned to Raj, I think it's a great quotation, the quotation from Jawaharlal Nehru. I am convinced that the only solution to the world's problems and the problems of the people of India lie in socialism. When I use this word, I do not mean it in a vague humanitarian way, but in the scientific economic sense. Socialism, however, is something more than an economic doctrine. It is a philosophy of life, and as such, it appeals to me. I see it as a way to end the poverty, the vast unemployment, the degradation, and the subjection of the people, of the Indian people, and the people of the world through socialism. Okay.
What a great ending. With that, we will end the program. Please stop the recording, Raj. And thank you all very much. We hope to see you all next week. Thank you again, Norman.
Thank you.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.